Most sequels build on their predecessors. Silksong chose to subvert them. After 7 years, Team Cherry didn't just give us more Hollow Knight, they gave us a risky yet unforgettable evolution of a masterpiece. This video talks about whether those evolutions were worth it. I loved Hollow Knight. I still do. There is no game that I could think of that was so challenging yet so accessible at the same time. It drew people in with its simple side-scrolling platformer design that melted beautifully with its art style. The mysterious story hidden beneath these quiet and desolate caves and ruins. Amazing characters that either help you or fight you but are charming no matter what. Memorable themes and locations that give you a sense of wonder, fear, excitement, anticipation, and above all, curiosity. The combat that asks nothing but the best from you. That last part is specifically what drew me in. I loved that challenge of learning and overcoming things in a physical sense. I loved how this world urged me to get better every step of the way, or else I wouldn't get to where I want. I wouldn't be able to obtain the things that I want. I would be missing out if I didn't adapt. Hollow Knight is often called a masterpiece, and I personally don't disagree, but from my perspective, it's such an inspiration to game developers all over, and in fact was one of my biggest inspirations to delve deeper into game development myself and master the art of how to make a good platformer. However, Hollow Knight was not only a good platformer, everything else was masterfully designed and executed. It's as if it took the best parts of all of my favorite games and tossed it into one cohesive and extraordinary experience. Every second I spent with this game, I would discover something new, feel myself grow closer to its world, improve my skills on all fronts, and fall deeper in love with this game. When I finished Hollow Knight, I told myself that I'll come back when the sequel is about to come out, and I'll do it all over again, but this time, I'll do it better and faster. When Hollow Knight Silksong was announced, with a release date of a couple weeks from the announcement, I hadn't played the original game for about 2 years. I knew it was good, and I remember having an amazing time with it, but I wasn't completely overhyped to hear about Silksong. All I knew is that I really felt like playing the first game again, so I hopped back in, just as a refresher, and breezed through this game at a much faster rate than I did my first time around. I think my second playthrough was almost more fun than my first, and that's when I realized why Hollow Knight is so influential. I thought that my second playthrough would have been mostly me trying to get the hang of things again and exploring more than I did the first time around, but it was so much more than that. The amount of muscle memory that returned to me, allowing me to fight bosses like Lost Kin, which I remember being one of the hardest bosses I had to fight in this game, without even breaking a sweat, all in one attempt. I found those secrets that, on my first playthrough, I had no idea how to get to. My intuition, my game sense would only continue to build off of my first time with the game. My biggest fear going into the sequel was that it would be way too similar to Hollow Knight 1. It's a very common trope that a sequel just goes with the bigger and better motto, changing little of what made the first game great and just building on top of it. Tears of the Kingdom, which I made a video about last month, is one of those games. It builds upon its predecessor's core formulas instead of throwing them out the window in exchange for a brand new experience from top to bottom, like previous games in the series. Horizon Forbidden West was a great sequel because it went for that bigger and better philosophy, except we also had a new world, a slew of new beasts, new mechanics, improvements across the board in animations, a story that takes the series in an entirely new direction. I'd like to think that this idea of making a game bigger and better than its preceding one is something that falls on a sort of spectrum. The left side is more so adding on top of the experience. Think sports games that are sort of re-released every year. The right side is the exact opposite, a sequel that is almost unrecognizable from the original game. Super Mario World, which is a classic platformer, and Yoshi's Island, or Super Mario World 2, where you don't even play as Mario and you could throw eggs, and the style is completely different and the gameplay is nothing like Super Mario World's. Another example is Zelda 1 vs. Zelda 2. One is a top-down open-world adventure game. The other is a side-scroller that is much more combat-focused. In a lot of cases, certain sequel games that fall under a specific genre or category need a continuation that properly respects and or juxtaposes its preceding game, something that can move the series forward and not only be a bigger and better game, but evolve, improve, and challenge the ideas of the game that came before it. And with Hollow Knight, I think a certain sequel had to be made. It couldn't just be Hollow Knight, but you're in a new area. It needed to be something that tapped into the wonder that came with the original game, but also live up to that game as it already exists. When looking at that spectrum, I believe Silksong is a game that falls far on the right side of it, and as a sequel, it did the best thing it possibly could have. Team Cherry knew exactly what step this sequel needed to make to stand firmly on its own and to be worthy of yet another 10 out of 10. Before we get into the meat of the video, beware that there are light early game spoilers throughout the video, but most of them are in the second half of the video where I may dive deeper into the first act of the game, so just be wary. This video is safe for those who have only gotten through the first act of the game. This is also the first part of a 3-part miniseries that is a love letter to what I think is one of the most impressive sequels I have ever played. Sit back, relax, and consider subscribing if you like my content. When I picked up Hollow Knight for the second time, mere weeks before Silksong's release, I planned to play through until 112%, not knowing what hardships I was going to face before I got there. Once I beat the whole game, I had decided that Pantheon 4 is where my journey will end. I remember reaching the Pure Vessel after a gauntlet of bosses for the first time, and I was completely blown away by the incredible speed and aggressive nature of this boss. Dying immediately once I reached that boss and thinking to myself that there's no way that I can do this. I went to that boss hall, I found the Pure Vessel statue, and this was the opportunity I had to practice. Truly memorize this entire fight, get it ingrained in my subconscious, because otherwise I wasn't going to beat it at the end of a 30 to 40 minute gauntlet. It felt like this fight required all of my practical knowledge of Hollow Knight, the skills I've been honing for the better part of 25 to 30 hours, and the knowledge I had carried over from my first playthrough in 2022. All that previous time I spent with this game in the span of 3 years all led up to the moment I landed that final hit onto the Pure Vessel and beat Pantheon 4. I don't think I'll do Pantheon 5 until a later stage of my life because I'm honestly dreading thinking about it right now. Once I had finished the goal of beating the Pure Vessel, it was time for me to move on, and luckily for me, that next step was Silksong, which had already been released for 3 days at that point. My initial worry loading into Hollow Knight's long-awaited sequel was that my previous knowledge with 1 would dictate how easy 2 ends up being for me. I hadn't been spoiled at all as to what I would be experiencing, except for the controversy surrounding Silksong's difficulty, which I'll touch upon throughout the series as I go. Having bested this incredibly difficult feat in the first game, the last thing I was expecting was to start over again, learning how to play Hollow Knight for the second time. Hollow Knight's Silksong does start off relatively easy in retrospect, but being that person, the person that just started off for the first time from the beginning, it's incredibly daunting when playing the tutorial part of the game, and I couldn't be more happy that that is the case. This game already throws a lot of stuff that seems fundamentally different from Hollow Knight at you right away with the introduction of objectives and acts. This game is clearly segmented for a reason. Hornet's first objective is laid out in the first 10 to 20 minutes of this game. This is incredibly simple, but it was a clever way to get me to bite, even though I was already hooked the second I began. Everything you know about Hollow Knight 1, except for how you choose to explore the world before you, is all thrown out the window. You're starting all over again, and it all begins with how Hornet moves through this world. The moveset you are given is entirely different even from the get-go, which is one of the many risks this game took. This moveset that we've gotten used to for so long now feels different. Not because it's missing those movement skills and upgrades, but it just feels fundamentally different, and it only gets wackier as you go through. The downward strike is now this diagonal attack that urges you to worry about positioning mid-air when the previous game asked you to time your continuous downward strikes. Yeah, you needed to make sure you were doing it on the enemy's head, but this diagonal shift, you now not only worry about the enemy's position, but your relation to it specifically. Making sure you're not too far to whiff and take damage, making sure your angle is just right to nail it clean on the head with your needle. That shift from timing to positioning is one of the first important changes this game forces upon you, and the reason it's there is incredibly neat. Because of this change and many others, I found myself in the same position I began Hollow Knight 1 with, getting used to myself again. This diagonal attack was also something I often used to ground myself quickly early on, and would help with dodging aerial attacks as well as platforming as soon as I found myself getting more accustomed to it. It's a fun replacement for the downward strike from Hollow Knight 1 that makes you interact with the world in a completely different way. Pogoing now happens differently with this forward momentum, and is easy to grasp but hard to master. In fact, I think that since I spent more time with the first game, I had a harder time getting used to Hornet's new downward movement initially. Before, you had to jump and dash your way above an enemy. Without a dash, I could still comfortably make my way above an enemy because the downward strike moved me forward. It was so fun to use when an enemy was rushing at me. Jump, down strike, comfortably land on the other side, and it looks really great too. The only issue I had was that I constantly wished it had a longer range, since I'd always downward strike at a level too high to be able to carry through and make contact with my target. In Hunter's March a couple hours later, this would be where the initial frustration became a new challenge I overcame. Like learning and memorizing a boss's patterns, I found myself learning and memorizing my own. This game felt unstable in my hands for the first hour. Mind you, I beat Pure Vessel before even beginning Silksong. That feeling of instability wasn't bad. It was the best thing this game could have done. In Hollow Knight, I felt like I was getting so good at the game, having done insane challenges that only 7% of players that have played the game dare to complete. That acclimating to the world of Farloom would be a cakewalk, with the difficulty ramping up later, eventually. This new moveset, the new locations, the bosses, completely flipped my knowledge of Hollow Knight on its head. Everything controlled just the same, but with this new font, new execution that threw me off effectively and made it adequately difficult from the very start. Even the dash in this game was changed to have downward momentum after a short moment that you have to take into account, whereas in Hollow Knight, it was a very straight shot forward with a sudden descent. Ledge grabbing is also a new addition to the moveset, and it feels incredible when you jump right out of one to gain extra jump height. These new moves and new ways of moving are heavily complemented with new and expansive animations that not only help Hornet express herself, but also bridge all of your moves so neatly together that it feels more acrobatic, and you can tell that's what Team Cherry wanted with Hornet and her movement. In Hollow Knight, you felt like this relentless force, an unstoppable knight. In Silksong, however, you feel like a paintbrush on a canvas. Fighting bosses felt a lot like a dance. Action, reaction, fight, flight. All the combat felt more artsy, and it made me feel so much more confident in myself when I would witness my own moves weaving so neatly around my target. But when a boss hit me with a devastating attack, I would suddenly begin to panic and try to recuperate, getting the least risky hits in so I could fill up my silk to the max and heal up. There were certain bosses in the early game that were indeed very challenging for newcomers and experts alike, and I wished that I had more time with each of them because of how genuinely fun it was to learn their moves, listen to their themes, and land that final blow. Each victory felt bittersweet because that's yet more of this game that I will never experience for the first time again. I personally didn't think that the first couple of bosses were too difficult. I don't usually get angry with Souls-like games anymore, since I've got a hefty collection of Souls-likes that I've mastered, and the first game I began with was Dark Souls 2, which to this day is one of my favorite games of all time. And if you've played Dark Souls 2, you'd probably know that I've got to be one patient guy if that's my favorite one. With these challenging games, each one is an opportunity for me to hone my practical skills that can be transferred to any difficult game I play, like learning how to study bosses and having the patience to commit to that learning process. If only I could have applied myself like this in school growing up. This external skill is what made the initial bosses of this game quick work for me, and I think that I still felt pretty challenged by each of them because of all the new stuff this game throws into the mix. I was always trying to prove myself with each of these first bosses. I wanted to show off how good I am at a game like this, but my external skills could only carry me so far if I didn't hone my internal skills like the downward strike and all the other skills that you're given by playing this game. Alongside bosses, there are the little guys in between each one, littering this huge world. Every enemy is completely different from the ones we've seen in Hollow Knight 1, with some of them looking incredibly similar but acting completely different. Enemies are a great shakeup in the sequel as well. These enemies have an interesting new set of abilities and attack patterns that are almost meant to stop you in your tracks sometimes. These enemies sometimes just get you good. Like, they'll hit you hard enough to make you forget where you were even going in the first place. One of the weirdest changes this game brings is to the currency system. This game's economy establishes itself as doubly complex as the last game. Two different things now drop from enemies, and sometimes you'll get more of one and less of the other. The value of metal shards seems initially very clear. Oh, this is Silksong's variant of Geo, but then that idea gets completely subverted when you get to the first settlement and realize that your metal shards can't be used to buy things, and instead, these red beads are what you should be looking for. But at this point, you've probably only encountered enemies that drop metal shards, so the mystery of how to get the beads is one of your top priorities as the player from the get-go. This is why the economy is complex. Metal shards remain a mystery until you find your first tool. Beads remain a mystery until you find an enemy that drops them or come across a whackable bead deposit. Beads are definitely different from Geo as well, even if they're a Geo replacement, so to speak. Beads are much rarer. They're also much harder to keep because of this game's increased difficulty overall. The amount of times that I would lose my beads permanently is leagues higher than the amount of times I've lost my Geo permanently on both my runs of Hollow Knight combined. In the first game, there was a faux bank that would steal your money, but you wouldn't even need to use it anyway because on average, you'd be keeping all your Geo or using it up as soon as possible to keep your risk of losing them a lot low. In Silksong, you have a genuine advantage in tying beads together in a necklace at a 20 bead cost in most or all cases. There were times where I would be anxious holding over 200 beads without handing them in at a vendor. This anxiety created a necessity to bank at the earliest convenience for me, and I always felt like that 20 bead loss was worth it because I knew what it felt like to lose 100% of my beads on a runback or a freak accident or a gotcha scenario. Like I said earlier, some enemies drop beads, but others drop metal shards, and some drop a varying amount of both. This has the weird side effect of having me memorize what certain enemies drop, especially since I've traveled constantly back and forth through this game's many areas. In some areas, I know deep down that I'll be getting more metal shards and less beads on average. In other areas, it's the other way around. This memorizing comes as a natural response to how important beads are and how desperately you need metal shards at any given moment, which, weirdly enough, those moments do in fact come if you use tools as much as I did. Because some enemies don't drop beads, I tend to avoid defeating them in particular, especially if they're annoying to try and fight. Sinner's Road's enemies come to mind. On the other hand, there are enemies that, despite being difficult, I will most likely fight since they drop a large amount of beads. This also had me treading specific paths to get to where I needed to go. Taking the shortest route while I'm low on beads might not be the best choice for me, so I would take a detour if I remembered that it would take me through a treacherous mob of bead-carrying enemies because I loved collecting them that much and I always needed more. I'd go out of my way to do things the hard way since it would be very rewarding most of the time. Hunter's March was an amazing early game bead farm, although I never felt like I was ever farming. I felt like I was learning the patterns of these enemies and getting surprised by their combos and patterns at every turn. I'd die a lot, but I would always get it back until one time I just couldn't. Hunter's March was my first experience losing all of my beads. I'd never felt defeated before with this game. That was a time I had to put my controller down and genuinely take a break. In my break, I realized something that changed my entire perspective of this game. I lost all my beads because I wasn't playing this like Silksong. When I played this game with the same frantic, offensive combat style I had fostered throughout Hollow Knight, tanking hits when necessary, getting greedy with my attacks, never using my full arsenal, I would very quickly be punished for playing this way. Since I was fighting the same way I fought in the first game, I died a lot more. This game had me rethinking and shedding the muscle memory of the old combat system and rewriting my own skills, resetting them to fit this new experience. It was so weird to me that the acrobatic nature of Hornet's moveset made me want to move faster, but if I tried to physically do that, I would overextend myself and die quickly. It was when I learned the art of patience in these difficult encounters. That was when I saw how easy it is to keep up that dance, if I just assessed the situation and acted accordingly. Each fight became a dance between action and response. Sometimes enemies have tells that come early enough for you to adapt on the fly and counterattack effectively, which just makes everything look so clean when you pull it off. Risk and reward dance around in my mind as I fly over enemies and stab them with such incredible precision. If I weren't so deeply focused on actually fighting, I'd be amazed by my own ability to not only pick these skills up, but look so cool pulling them off too, even though I'm nowhere near the best Silksong player. This incredible moveset is not only dynamic within combat, but it also makes Hollow Knight 1's tight traversal mechanics pale in comparison. Silksong has so many hidden mechanics that you're bound to just begin using by complete accident. The game never tells you that there's a run jump and even a run attack. You get the chance to discover more about yourself. This world is enormous, and you can miss a lot of those early collectibles, but now you also have these fun and useful implicit abilities that you could also miss for a while after obtaining those explicit abilities. Exploring the world happens alongside discovering yourself. When I found out that you could run and do a run stab, I felt so rewarded by finding it, even though it's just a little mechanic. The best part is that it felt like dashing was built into this world. Long, flat hallways, faraway ledges that feel as though they were meant to be leapt towards. The running mechanic even has this feature that allows you to quickly vault up short steps. I'm yapping about the movement right now and I stand by every word. This is just such a fun set of concepts strung together so effectively that moving around never seemed like a chore anymore, but rather a speedrunning challenge filled with all the techniques I learned along the way. If you're less experienced with platforming, you can definitely take it slow and at your own pace, but if you're in a hurry like I was at times, you have your own options too. Traversing the same areas now has so many different ways to do it and fits so many diverse playstyles, it's easier than ever to travel around the realm the way you want to. As someone coming from Hollow Knight 1, I have to come clean. I very rarely use spells in fights. I'd rather keep my soul gauge full and lose out on the extra damage instead of using spells when I'm full on soul, because I think it was genuinely too much for me to handle at times. I love the nail combat more than anything else, so I stuck to that, and whenever I would tank hits, I would always need some healing left in my reserves because I loved playing so aggressively. Spells felt optional and not like something I would need to use in a pinch. The tools, however, are the exact opposite. It feels like if you neglect using every weapon at your disposal here in Silksong, you're screwed. I employed throwing knives for long-range damage and something more devastating but situational as my second tool in most cases. These tools were something I could genuinely get behind. They need metal shards to upkeep, they upgrade alongside you, granted you explore the world adequately enough and do the little quests strewn about. In the first game, I was reluctant to use spells because although on a surface level it seems very intuitive to use one source for both healing and special attacks, it worked heavily against my own combat style of playing aggressively and tanking hits often. I always had a voice telling me that I'm going to need this stockpiled soul for my health rather than quick damage at a distance. And I could miss the enemy too, which would be devastating if I messed up. Silksong made it so much more accessible, possible, and fun to just dish out a different type of attack, one that could give you a noticeable advantage when you're seemingly at a disadvantage. My best use case was when I was close to the end of a fight, but simultaneously at my last hit. I used my remaining tools to deal effective and relatively safe damage without risking death. It's worked so many times in a pinch that I never hesitated to use tools. I loved the system so much. The only problem I had with it personally was that they bound the tool button so dangerously close to your special attack that it was super easy to trigger the special attack instead, and that wastes precious silk that you might need. This was not a smart move in my opinion, but like everything else, I got used to it and eventually forgot about it when I got really into the combat and conditioned myself to make sure to press up or down before the right bumper. It wasn't perfect, but it worked in most cases for me. It made me think for a second that this might be by design. If you're accidentally using special abilities, you're more likely to find a great use for them. For the first time in Hollow Knight history, I actually did use the special moves. I really loved one of them that allows you to deal a massive amount of damage at a short range all around you. I abused it in moments where my health was full and my silk was plentiful. I assumed that my neglect of the earlier spell system came from how genuinely wasteful it would seem sometimes to miss your spell attacks, whereas with the silk attacks, I always found a specific low-risk situation in which to use my special that made it more useful for me. I also felt like I had to use my extended range of abilities because the nail often felt so underpowered on its own in the early game, and I'm not really sure if this was intended, but I went into this experience with the notion that Team Cherry had 7 years to ponder about the meta. And while there are a lot of valid points people bring up about the meta that I will be talking about later, I think that the nail was intentionally underpowered so that the other tools at your disposal could shine more. Since your health is either low as all hell or high enough not to worry about at the moment, there's always a time where you could spare some silk to deal some extra damage, especially since bosses stagger a lot, exposing themselves for a neat barrage of damage. While it's still a risk, it feels to me, in the moment, less of one. With the Beastfly boss at the beginning of the game, I was really challenged with all I had, healing at the right opportunities, using my abilities and tools, dodging and counterattacking at the right times. It also showcased the game's new health meta effectively. In Hollow Knight, I had the opportunity to tank hits and play aggressively, whereas in Silksong, I was in either one of two categories usually, especially in the early game, feeling confident and full of health, or feeling like I'm so close to dying that my hands start to shake, my breathing became deep, and my stress began to heighten. Team Cherry had come out and said this is exactly what they wanted, according to The Edge magazine in 2020. Team Cherry made a deliberate decision to make combat feel like it's snapping between these two states. You spend more time either at full health or almost dead. With the level of thought put into this controversial mechanic by Team Cherry, it really makes me think that there's no way that everything else in the game could be half-baked, and that's why it's so hard. They even related the new health mechanics directly to who Hornet is, this character of extremes. Some people online say that it makes for a more memorable experience. You're so low on health so often, it feels like not only a struggle to maintain your sanity, but you feel massively relieved when you hit that bind in a pinch and heal up a substantial amount. They're not wrong, that does make for some very engaging fights, and that oscillation between the two extremes has been my experience so far, which is quite engaging. Most people actually agree with this combat change. They do, however, have solid nitpicks, and even though I personally never had an issue with many of them, I can't just not bring these concerns up, because they exist. There's a common issue with the bosses dealing damage, a lot of it while they're stunned or staggered, which can be unfair for sure. Sometimes it's hard to be able to tell when a boss will get staggered, and especially with the ones right above you, it's easy to get crushed under them and take 2 masks of damage. Sometimes the stun to hitboxes can be hard to gauge or predict, making it hard to position yourself without getting hit beforehand. From one angle, it seems like a proper concern. In Souls games, it's very rare or outright not possible to get hit when an enemy is staggered, and so now it becomes ever so important that this stays fair. Taking 2 masks of damage for getting too close to a downed enemy doesn't really make sense, since we shouldn't get so severely punished during what should be a light victory. On the other hand, get good. That's literally it. I don't mean that. Looking at it from a game developer's perspective, I would ideally want to put the same care into every aspect of combat, not just the new healing and damage balancing. If I were Team Cherry, I would not have made this a thing after testing my own game for half a decade, but we got it anyways, so I guess, I don't know. This is what we got. I would have personally made it like 1 mask if they really wanted to make it still like a hazard. I really do applaud their efforts for being able to shake things up so comprehensively and still have it work so well. There are always hiccups when reinventing something that on a surface level was already so perfect, but I think it was always a necessity. Once again, we as players needed to feel that same uncomfortable and sometimes punishing feeling of making mistakes and learning from them. Because of how different these 2 games are, despite being in the same franchise, there's one thing that struck at me the most, and it's that these 2 games feel nothing like each other about 80% of the time. This game, like its cover art, feels more fiery, red, with combat feeling frantic and calculated like capoeira, and world design that reflects this more warm feeling. Hollow Knight 1 felt more somber, quiet, and cold. It felt pale and dramatic, like contemporary. My mind immediately fixated on how different these games feel from each other, and I'm sure that I'll feel a new wave of nostalgia rolling in as I begin a new playthrough of Silksong a couple years from now. One thing I wasn't expecting at all combat-wise was the different crests you find across the world. Each one is different from the last, and honestly, when I picked up my first one, the Crest of the Beast, I was really turned off by it. I didn't like how frantic and persistent you had to be with it, not only to deal damage, but to stay alive, and so I switched back at the earliest convenience. This made me think that none of the crests would call out to me the same way the first one did. I find that with games that have multiple stances to switch between, I tend to choose the one or ones that I find first, since those are the playstyles I have the most practice with, and having to switch to another playstyle when I'm so used to the first one can be jarring and can feel like my knowledge got set back a bit while the option to switch back remains. This game does something clever by forcing you to switch to the crest you've just obtained, meaning you're forced to try it out for about 5 to 10 minutes to see if you like it on your way to a nearby bench. In Star Wars Jedi Survivor, there's a similar system where you can equip 2 stances at once and switch between those 2 on the fly, while the others require you to rest and equip them through meditation, which are, funny enough, that game's equivalent of a bench. In that game, I actually tried a lot of the stances because each of them had their strengths and weaknesses. I was also desperate to try out some new moves since the prior game already had 2 stances that were brought over to the new one. Finally, the game had a huge skill tree with some real intriguing upgrades that were locked behind specific stances. In Silksong, there aren't any skill trees, but there are immediate benefits and drawbacks to each crest, and each one can be upgraded individually. Since I only really stuck to one crest for the whole game and felt as though switching would complicate things for me, I never really cared too much about memory lockets after I got all the ones I wanted for the base crest, and then the crest I eventually switched to. The fact that I switched at all is indicative of one of 2 things. 1, I just happened to find a crest objectively better than the base one, or 2, this crest was the one I naturally gravitated towards because of how it instantly called out to me personally. I'd like to hope that it was the second one and that everyone out there gravitated specifically to a crest that called out to them, but the Reaper crest was the perfect one for me. I loved how the downward strike was more controllable and had a wider arc. The attacks were slower, but they felt like they had a bit more reach. The only downside I could see was that the upward strike was one-sided and backwards facing, so I had to adapt to facing away from my enemy quickly if it was in front of me and above me. I got the hang of this crest so quickly otherwise, and I loved the upward dash attack, not to mention that the healing ability that it has is absolutely amazing but has its own risks built in. I'm genuinely curious to see how many people stuck with the Reaper as well. Let me know in the comments. Also, let me know what your favorite crest was. I'd love to hear about it. I think that I avoided crests that had an unbalanced amount of trinket spots, like more reds than yellows or blues, or more blues than yellows and reds. I liked keeping things balanced overall, and I really needed that compass, so when I didn't have memory lockets early on, it makes total sense as to why I would switch back to a balanced crest so I could use the compass again. The Reaper Crest was that balanced but different playstyle that I was looking for, at the detriment of my attack speed, mostly. But I didn't care because I love greatswords and this felt like my own little greatsword run. I think it'd be super cool if this game had a new game plus, because I could see myself doing specific runs of this game but locked to certain crests. As much as I would suggest making each crest something that would be viable for players to switch between, I'm not sure if the intent Team Cherry had all along was for players to just choose one and stick to it, and maybe switch if they found a new and even more suitable one later down the line. All I can say is that, as things currently are, I wanted to use the other crests, but not enough to the point of actually committing to one. While it sounds like a great idea to force the player to try each one, by force switching to the one you just obtained, nothing forces us to get used to them. I feel like most of the time I would try a new one, then not like it, and then switch back rather than somehow being coerced into liking each one and not know which one to choose. I could add something here, but that would be spoiler territory, and I'd like to save that for another video. Why did I engage with Star Wars Jedi's Survivor's stance system more than the Crest system? Because you not only had multiple stances to choose from, but you could mix and match them together in awesome ways, which made it easier to keep using a stance I'm comfortable with and occasionally switch to a stance I'm trying to currently get the hang of when backtracking through easier areas. They didn't limit your perks, and the perks were kept separate from the stances. Each stance looked different and had this visual element, whereas the gameplay and animation limitations of Silksong can't make the visuals look too different or flashy, since you're basically switching your combat style rather than your weapon. Your needle doesn't really take on this new form or anything, because that's not seemingly how it works. I ended up feeling bad for not using new crests. Like, there are entirely different ways of playing the game, and I'm skipping over them because I simply don't want to start over again and learn the basics when I'm already 2/3 into the game. If that's just me, I don't consider this mechanic a failure. But if a large majority of people have this exact same experience, feeling bad for not interacting with newer crests on a deeper level, then this mechanic is flawed as is. The good thing is that there was a style I found to be best for me, and that's good enough. The content I did want to engage with was great. In fact, I think it was excellent. Speaking of content, I never found myself too interested in the lore of the world of Hollow Knight 1. Maybe in a future video I'll delve into what the story really means for me, but one question intrigued me the most about Silksong, and that's when it takes place in relation to Hollow Knight 1. This entire time I thought the game was a prequel, but after a bit of research I figured out that it's actually a sequel. That's crazy to think about. Whether it's a prequel or a sequel, I was instantly curious about one thing, and it was how Silksong would flip the vibes of the first game on its head. In Hollow Knight, the world is dying. The world is more still, unmoving, quiet. Hallownest is overall a much more somber and defeated world because of the infection that threatens to take it all over. There is no future here. Most regions in the game are devoid of their previous grander presences that they must have once had. The City of Tears feels as though it has reached the end of times. The only thing remaining here are creatures whose souls have died while their bodies are not their own. The royal waterways are filthy and unkempt, filled with enemies that look almost entirely like maggots, which in our real world are a sign of death. The Forgotten Crossroads becomes infected as you play the game, showing off that there's only more death here as you go. In the first game, you start from the top, and you can only really descend lower, deeper into the grave. The Hollow Knight itself is hollow because its sacrifice was hollow in of itself. There's no point in saving Hallownest. It was doomed before you pressed play. On the other hand, you have a sequel that challenges the idea of death completely and as often as possible. In Silksong, you have these quests that urge you to rebuild and assist those around you because not all hope is lost. You've arrived in Farloom seemingly during the most pivotal time in its history, and you as the player who plays the game should be determined to fix it because it seems like you can, and not only that, but it continuously seems like you do fix things and mend things as you go. This world moves almost immediately as you enter it. Going through the first area and walking past that sprawling field and watching the critters fly up in droves is indicative of this complete inversion of Hollow Knight 1's vibes. In Deep Docks, enemies are endlessly working and you traverse through entire areas where machines are still active and at times reanimating in front of you. Birds have populated nests in Greymoor. Hunter's March has little ants crawling everywhere. Most of these enemies are hostile by default or brought back to life by this ghastly Silk. Yes, you could say that the infected were also a form of undead, but they're seemingly in a constant state of dying, whereas the haunting looks like it brings the dead back to life. It works very similarly to the Radiance as far as I know, but the imagery of white silk binding to something and reanimating it is definitely more lively than an infection that takes over a living being throughout time. Settlements now grow as you play, and the quests you are given only help people that are clinging onto their last hopes. The haunting has definitely knocked the morale of Farloom's residents down a lot, but Hornet seems stoic and hopeful no matter what, realistic yet always looking forward to making things better. Her capabilities as a main character are massively expanded because she has such an active voice in everything, and not only that, but she's very wise, down to earth, but strict and unwavering in her tone. She will not align with others' rules and motives if they differ from hers, but she's perfectly fine living in the same world and agreeing to disagree if that is a choice. In the first game, we play as a mute character, so our understanding of the world is very much focused on how the player decides to interact with it and what conclusions they could draw on their own. Meanwhile, in Silksong, we have a character through which we experience it all. Her motivations sort of became my own as I played. I knew that I naturally wanted what Hornet wanted. From the outset, I was just as curious as her to find out who brought me here and who will have to meet the end of my needle by the end of this whole ordeal. This game had sunk its hooks in me because I felt connected to Hornet in more ways than just the A button and the control stick. I felt connected to her in terms of motivation, and that is such a treat. It's hard to ignore that Hollow Knight's roots are in its difficulty, and even harder to ignore as a fan of Dark Souls, that Hollow Knight intentionally borrows a lot of its DNA and twists it into its own 2D style. Silksong feels like it leans more into the Dark Souls games than the first game did. Enemies hit harder now than they ever have before. The game feels harder on average than Hollow Knight 1, where in that game some areas were difficult, with others being notably easier. Silksong is challenging you throughout, and the way it's paced is absolutely phenomenal in my opinion. I never felt like the game was too easy or monotonous. It felt like I had to pay attention every step of the way, or else I'd be at risk of losing progress. Sometimes finding rosary strings and metal shards in the wild felt like collecting fading souls and the souls of a hero in Dark Souls. One thing Dark Souls had was runbacks. I've heard a lot of buzz about runbacks regarding this game specifically. On one hand, runbacks effectively create a boss timer, meaning if you die, your only choice is to wait that timer out by making your way back to the arena. On the other hand, runbacks give you time to reflect on what you did wrong before you go at it again. Runbacks may seem like a waste of time, but the more I look into this, the more it seems like a matter of preference. Some people also tend to concentrate differently than others, requiring more time on average to get in the zone. And once you take it away from them, it's hard to get the engines started up again, so to speak. Now, I'm not an expert on human psychology, but I wonder if it's possible to learn the skill of concentration, even if you're at a mental disadvantage. Either way, it's a valid reason to not like them. But then again, when have games ever catered to every single person in existence? Some people still think games rot your brain and make you more likely to commit crime. I know that a large majority of people think that runbacks are a way for developers to pad their runtime of a game, stating that the world is so intricately designed, but runbacks turn those same places into tedious, repetitive, and monotonous places to traverse. Other players say that in retrospect, the runbacks aren't too bad, and I fall into that category. Runbacks are as bad as you think they are. And I mean that literally. I had to change my mindset from this is annoying and repetitive to what can I learn from my failed attempt along the way? How do I optimize my movement to make it back there as quickly as possible? One user on Steam put it very eloquently, I think. A long run back is part of the boss encounter. Why I follow this philosophy is because I see the game in a different light than others. People generally buy games to challenge themselves and have fun, but when that fun is taken away, of course it can feel boring. The way I personally found fun in that boredom was thinking about what runbacks do for me personally. They help me get used to the world. They help me with my muscle memory in certain areas. They force me to look around more for shortcuts or optimal routes. They allow me to focus and think of improvements, and they remind me to be patient with the process, with the long road ahead, with myself. Runbacks helped me calm down after a long, rigorous back and forth that was just shy of victory. With runbacks, it boils down to, do you personally wish to see this game as a fun challenge, or do you wish it to teach you things that'll help you in other games, in the real world? Whatever your answer is, it's correct, and it's also a great reason for your take on this controversial game system. For me, Souls-likes, difficult combat games, are always something I see as a learning experience. From the moment I set foot in Farloom, I knew that I would be playing this game to learn, to remind myself to be resilient, to know when to take breaks, to stop myself when I'm taking things too seriously or too far. Runbacks are what personally taught me the art of patience, by sending me far away at times and forcing me to make my way back with every death. It reinforced the idea that death and losing progress should hurt. it should make you angry, but overcoming that anger and moving past it is what usually got me my victories. Pairing that up with my previous experience with difficult bosses throughout my life is what also got me my victories. Being patient with a game that tries to push you to your limits doesn't come easy, and I had my moments with this game that made me want to slam my hands on my desk and chuck my controller across the room, but the reason I walked away from it thinking it was one of the greatest games I've played in the last 5 years was because of the lens through which I decided to view it. I wanted this game to teach me and to reinforce those skills I've been honing, to remind me of the human qualities I deem important to myself: patience, concentration, attention to detail, rapid thinking, memory, action and response, but above all else, it reminded me once again of what it's like to feel for a game. Moments of sudden hatred, followed by moments where my heart would physically flutter because of how beautiful and precious this game is to me. As of now, I've finished 90% of this entire game, and while I'd rather save most of my thoughts for the next video, I do want to say this. I love this game, and I think I loved it even more than I loved Hollow Knight. The movement, the gameplay, the biomes, the boss fights, and Hornet as a character were all things that drew me further into this game. Every frustration I had was backed up with, "But I'm glad that happened," since after every setback, I got the privilege to live in this world just a bit longer, talk to its characters and help them discover each corner I could. As much as I love this game, I definitely understand the frustrations people have with it in certain areas, even though I don't personally think the same way about it. Everyone's entitled to an opinion, and these worries about a game's difficulty are warranted to a degree. Silksong had a whole game preceding it, one that was so influential and impactful, one that told more than just a story about shades and souls. It told aspiring game developers that at this game's core is two people that took a random game jam idea and ran with it, making their dream game. It inspired people with its graphics, its tightly designed gameplay, and its wondrous world. With a sequel, the easy path was to go bigger and better, and Silksong did that and more. The more I played it, the less I thought of my time with Hollow Knight 1 and began just enjoying this game for what it is. And that is another win for Silksong. As a sequel, it subverts expectations in all the right places. It iterates on mechanics very nicely and introduces so much new. These all melt together so cleanly too. It feels like Hollow Knight again, and then as you play, it evolves into something more, something distinct from its predecessor, something that stands firmly as its own entry. Hollow Knight's success and legacy is not diminished by the release of this game. In my eyes, it's rare that I play a sequel this perfect in almost every way, and that's my take, or at least a third of it. Thanks for watching, and look forward to my next video about this game, where we'll be delving into the mid and late game. That's where the rest of my ideas can really thrive, so I'm really excited about that. As much as I wanted to make one large video, it would definitely be too long of a wait, and it would probably be something that a lot of people don't make it to the end of, so I decided to split it. Thank you for your patience nonetheless, and subscribe if you made it here. I really appreciate the view nonetheless. Become a channel member for early access to my videos and a cool banner, and you get your name featured on the screen at the end of each video, like this right now. Leave some video topic recommendations below, and if you'd like me to cover something specific in the next Silksong video, feel free to leave a suggestion for that as well. Take care, everybody, and don't forget to brush your teeth.